Mesdames et messieurs, distingués invités, bonsoir et bienvenue au Musée canadien de l'Histoire. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Canadian Museum of History. My name is Dean Oliver, and I am very proud to be the museum's Senior Director for Research and its Chief Curator. I have only about 45 minutes to speak to you this evening. I say that only for the minor heart palpitations it will cause my colleagues. J'aimerais d'abord souligner que l'endroit où nous sommes réunis aujourd'hui se trouve sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé de la nation algonquin Anishinaabe. The museum is deeply pleased to be partnering this evening for a second time with the Walrus Foundation and its sponsors. We hope there'll be a third and a fourth and other times after that. We feel very strongly ourselves about the value of informed discussion and debate, and tonight's topic we found particularly timely and delightfully, maddeningly complex. To take just one possible example, the concept of the geopolitical frontier, where one people's dominance ends and another's is potentially beginning, is ancient, though it coexisted, and still does in many places, with nomadic concepts of movement and shared authority, often according to need. The delineation of those frontiers into recognized and mutually, one hopes, respected borders, barriers, and access points is of somewhat more modern origin. These are, generally speaking, more rigid and more fixed, more easily recognizable, and therefore the points beyond which one set of laws or even customs prevail, and others equally generally do not. Boundaries, in other words, can protect and they can provoke. They can portend order, and yet they may protect sheer chaos. They are inherently dilemmas, some long-lasting and of gentle mien, others challenged in dramatic fashion, as we see on our television screens every day, by massive human migration of those fleeing oppression or war or natural disaster, or simply seeking opportunity. Ease of communication and information sharing has not always been matched, therefore, by ease of physical movement or collaboration, eroding some boundaries, reinforcing others. Nation-states have long faced such challenges, though they are undoubtedly more acute in our own time. At both the History Museum and our sister museum, the Canadian War Museum across the river, you can find many such examples in our programs and exhibitions. Canada turned away the MS Saint Louis, a ship filled with Jews fleeing obscene levels of persecution in Europe during the Second World War. It interned resident Ukrainians and others during the First World War, and Japanese Canadians, many of them themselves First War veterans of Canada's own forces during the Second. Mais en tant que pays, nous avons également réussi à surmonter nos instincts de protection pour abattre les murs et s'ouvrir aux autres. La médaille Nansen, que reçut notre pays pour l'accueil de réfugiés du Vietnam dans les années 1970, est exposée dans la salle de l'histoire canadienne où on peut aussi voir une présentation sur l'accueil récent de milliers de réfugiés de la Syrie au Canada. Finalement, le musée a un projet d'histoire orale pluriannuel qui veille à ce que de telles histoires survivent à notre époque, comme des rappels de bonté dans les temps à venir. Boundaries protect and they divide. They clarify and cloud. They contribute to identity and can unify effort while stigmatizing the other and denying them our needed help. They can preserve rights and make sure those same rights are denied or systematically diminished. Those of past times, erected in peace or amity or with good intentions, may later be found to be provocative or calculating or unduly punitive. They are neither permanent nor ever-changing, in other words, but must be useful in order to be just, and just in order to be useful. Tonight's ensuing discussions, I know, will be lively, and I look forward to them immensely. It's my pleasure to have all of you here. And now it's my even greater pleasure to introduce to you the Executive Director of the Walrus, Shelley Ambrose. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Welcome to CIFAR Presents the Walrus Talks Boundaries. I am indeed Shelley Ambrose, Executive Director of the Walrus. We're thrilled to be back here at the Canadian Museum of History in this beautiful space. And the Walrus, as you may know, started 16 years ago as an optimistic project to foster conversation across Canada. We, like you, recognize that these conversations are complex and necessary, and so they take many forms at the Walrus. We create conversations through fact-based journalism at the Walrus magazine and daily at thewalrus.ca. Some of you may have heard me say this before, fact-based journalism. We used to be able to just say journalism, and now we say fact-based journalism because we have real-life human fact-checkers. We also create conversations through a whole bunch of projects like the Walrus Books and the Walrus Podcasts, and in rooms like this at the Walrus Talks. So no matter where the Walrus is or how it is consumed, we embrace our commitment to be independent and to bring together interesting and interested people who care about issues that matter. So thank you for joining us today and for sharing and supporting our commitment to this work. So hands up if you read the Walrus. Welcome. Hands up if you support Walrus journalism financially by subscribing or donating. These are my people. These are all of my people. Hands up if you've attended a Walrus Talks before. Ooh, welcome back. And hands up if you're new. Let's welcome the new people. Yes. So new people, tonight is our 113th Walrus Talks. Where have you been? We're very happy that you're with us tonight. Thank you all for being here, and to the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, that's what CIFAR means. Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, for making this event possible. We're very grateful for the support for these conversations, and we're excited that we're kicking off tonight a 4-event series with CIFAR. CIFAR is a Canadian-based global charitable organization that convenes extraordinary minds to address science and humanity's most important questions. To tell us more about CIFAR's research and programs, please welcome President and CEO Alan Bernstein. I'll be right here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shelley. And bonjour à tous and bonsoir. I'm really pleased to be here at the Museum of Natural History. When I worked here in Ottawa, it was called the Museum of Civilization, but things change. This is, as Shelley just told you, the first of 4 talks that CIFAR is doing in partnership with the Walrus. We're very pleased to be partnering with this magazine. We value what they stand for and what they do, and how important the conversations are that Walrus promotes. Each of our Walrus talks will be on one of the 4 areas that's of importance to us: life and health, individuals and society, earth and space, and information and matter. The Walrus's mission, since Shelley told you what our mission is, I'll tell you what the Walrus's mission is. It's to provoke new thinking and to spark conversation on matters that are vital to Canadians. It is a mission that sparks curiosity and bold ideas, and that is exactly what CIFAR is also about. CIFAR convenes extraordinary minds to address the most important questions facing science and humanity. We were founded on a disarmingly simple idea: bring together the very best scientists and scholars from around the world, regardless of discipline, regardless of national border, speaking of borders, to identify and address the most important global challenges facing science and humanity, with a vision that's not constrained by disciplinary boundaries, geographic borders. We nourish the exploration of bold ideas, risk-taking, and transformative knowledge sharing. And our model works. Our community of fellows, advisors, CIFAR's Azrieli Global Scholars, and Canada CIFAR AI chairs now includes 19 Nobel laureates and more than 400 researchers from 23 countries, including this year's winners of the highest awards in this country in the physical sciences, the Hertzberg Medal, and in the social sciences, the Shirk Gold Medal. And we're very proud of that record of excellence of our fellows. Over the last 37 years, CIFAR has been a catalyst for many significant research breakthroughs such as and including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the importance of a child's early years, and the socioeconomic determinants of health. In fact, the revolution in AI started here in Canada and was catalyzed by CIFAR. It was made possible because of the research environment of risk-taking and bold thinking that we foster. Today, we lead Canada's national AI strategy, the Pan-Canadian AI strategy. Actually, it's the first of its kind in the world. The theme of tonight's talk was inspired in part by the visionary research being conducted by CIFAR fellows in our new program called Boundaries, Membership and Belonging, some of whom are here today, and two of them are going to be on our speakers this evening, so I'm not going to tell you more about that program. But I will say that they will be addressing what has become, I think surprisingly to a lot of people, an issue that is of such importance in today's world. Between the wall that President Trump wants to build with Mexico, the Brexit incident, the rising incidence of populism around the world, all of a sudden boundaries have become kind of a leitmotif for the times that we live in. And of course, we've always lived in a world of boundaries, boundaries between our neighbors, good fences make good neighbors, boundaries between cities, our provinces and countries, the boundaries between life and death, and Adrian Owen, I'm sure, will talk a little bit about that this evening, boundaries between humans and machines. I would recommend reading Ian McEwan's new novel, Becoming Human, which is exactly on that topic. But we also live in a world that's increasingly globalized, and at the same time, the challenges facing the planet are increasingly globalized. So we have this tension between boundaries and the global nature of the world that we live in. And on that matter, I would urge all of us to listen to Greta Thunberg's, the young woman from Sweden's talk, her address at the UN today. It's very short and it's extremely powerful. And it deals with the challenges of boundaries and climate change, of course, that the world is facing today. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I think we have an amazing group of speakers, and I look forward to speaking with many of you during the reception that follows. There's a table outside the reception where you can learn more about CIFAR, and I hope you'll sign up to receive our newsletter and magazine. And thank you again, and I hope you all enjoy tonight's very stimulating conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bernstein. I noticed that Dr. Bernstein's bio is not in your program along with the actual talkers for tonight, so I thought that I should just tell you that he is an officer of the Order of Canada and was in 2015 inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, which is amazing. I just thought that was quite incredible. As you've heard, the conversations around boundaries, membership, belonging are increasingly important to each of us. And tonight you'll hear from 7 researchers, writers, artists, and advocates about boundaries in every way from the physical to the political to the personal. So here is how the Walrus Talks works. There are 7 talkers. Each has 7 minutes. They know this. Each will come up and introduce themselves. Please follow along in the program. Speaker order on one side. Their bios, if you'd like to know more about them, are on the back of your program. You will hear 7 talkers all in a row. I will not pop up in between and say anything. They will just come fast and furious, one after the other. And once you've heard them all and have all kinds of new ideas in your head, we will have lots to talk to you about at the post-talks reception, to which you are all invited. So just before I let our talkers get underway, I'd like to thank each in advance. So thank you to Mary Soderstrom, author of Frenemy Nations, Love and Hate Between Neighboring States. I just have to say that book, its pub date is next week, but we have them here tonight. The first time Mary actually saw her own book was here tonight. It's that hot off the press. Thank you to Paige Raveon, CIFAR Fellow and Professor, Department of History, University of British Columbia. Thank you to Keith Banting, CIFAR Advisor and Professor Emeritus, Queen's University. Thank you to Adrian Owen, Co-Director of the CIFAR Azrieli Program in Brain, Mind, and Consciousness, and Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Western University. Go Western. Sorry, it's me. Jake Stika, Executive Director of Next Gen Men, Prerna Singh, CIFAR Fellow and Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Brown University, and Samra Habib, writer, photographer, and activist. Thank you all for coming. Let us begin.
Hello, I'm Mary Soderstrom, and I want to tell you a story. In the summer of 1968, my husband and I loaded up our VW Beetle and immigrated to Canada. We were young, we were distressed about the war in Vietnam, and we were hopeful that we'd find something different across the border. But to be honest, we didn't expect things to be too different. Weren't Canada and the United States pretty much alike? True. Lots of people spoke French in Montreal, where we were headed, and beer had a higher alcohol content. Both of those things we thought were great. But other differences came sharply into focus even before we entered Canada at Windsor. We had arrived in Detroit on the Sunday of Labor Day weekend, about the time the sun came up. We had driven all night for reasons that don't belong in this story. It was too early to present our papers to Canadian officials, so we got off the freeway to look around. What we saw were deserted streets lined with burnt-out buildings and piles of rubble left over from the riots of the summer before. It was devastation of a sort we had never seen, and when eventually we made it downtown, we were still shaken. To make the best of the situation, we went to the nicest hotel we could find to eat breakfast and to wash up a little, having driven all night. The breakfast was good and the welcome cordial. It helped that a professional baseball team was in town to play the Detroit Tigers, and my husband, with his crew cut, might have been a ball player. That also made us feel good. But then when we left, we found a black man with a sleeping bag over his shoulders crouching next to a shopping cart just outside the hostel's grounds. He was homeless, probably, something I hadn't encountered before. He got up quickly and took off when we approached. The contrast across the border couldn't have been greater. Windsor was cleaner and had no burnt-out buildings that we could see. Folks were polite in the working-class neighborhood where we stopped to buy provisions for lunch. "Pardon me?" the young man behind the counter asked when he didn't catch what we'd said. "Sorry," said someone else as he brushed past us on his way out. Of course, we would soon learn that slavery had been legal in Canada until the 1830s, that generations of Indigenous Canadians have suffered from genocidal policies, that prejudice continues against people of color, and that homelessness would become commonplace. Yet by the time we reached Montreal on the afternoon of a hot, muggy Labor Day, it was clear, Toto, that we weren't in Kansas anymore. Why, I wondered. Why, indeed, were there two Vietnams at that point? Why, I asked myself later, were Vermont and New Hampshire so different from each other? Then, as I learned more about my new country, I tried to figure out how Saskatchewan could produce Tommy Douglas and Alberta Stephen Harper. Obviously, in each case, a boundary separates the political entities. Usually, it reflects geography. The Connecticut River separates Vermont, the home of Bernie Sanders, from New Hampshire, the live free and die state. Live free or die state. In Vietnam, the boundary was also natural, the Ben Hai River just north of the Hai Van Pass through a spur of the mountains that extends into the sea. On the north side, cold winds from China blow in winter, while south of the pass, the weather is much warmer. Sometimes, though, the boundary is arbitrary, like the one between Alberta and Saskatchewan, which literally is just a line on the map. The one between the United States and Canada is a combination of both kinds. This probably looks familiar to you, but it dates from 1755. This copy is marked with red lines made over several decades following its publication. At the top, the cartographer drew straight lines indicating, can you see that? The difference between the land which was claimed by the Hudson's Bay Company and the French possessions. And, yeah, okay. He also carefully delineated the boundary set out in various treaties between European powers. The map served as a reference by all sides during the boundary talks between the United States and those responsible for British North America. You can see various propositions and other lines drawn on this copy. This map is called, I think it's the Red Line map, and it was presented to George III, and a copy of it is at Southern Maine, University of Southern Maine. Anyway, the boundaries suggested were based on river courses, the height of the land, and where little had been mapped by Europeans, lines of latitude. What would have happened had other lines been adopted? The St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers had been suggested as boundaries at one point. And certainly if that had been chosen as the boundary between British North America and the United States, Ottawa as a national capital wouldn't be here. What else would be different? Would a Canada based on peace, order, and good government have developed? We have no way of knowing. What is clear is that once boundaries are determined, people use them to their own ends. Things change. Vietnam has been one country for more than 40 years. Alberta had a brief flirtation with the NDP. Both New Hampshire and Vermont voted against Donald Trump in 2016. And many, many things have happened in the US and Canada over the last 240 years that have resulted in them diverging, not converging, on many important cultural and social and political points. And then there's a present-day case of the Ottawa River. How many of you noted that you'd entered another province when you crossed it today? Okay. How many know that both sides are part of the Canadian National Capital Region? Yet the river might still be, a boundary between Canada and an independent Quebec. What happens will depend on how people on the two sides act in the future. As I said, at the beginning, I wanted to tell a story. It's clear that we have not reached its end. Like all stories about boundaries, it is one that is to be continued, or as one says in Quebec, à suivre. Oh, yes, sir.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paige Raveon. I'm a historian of settler descent. My ancestors came to Canada from Hungary, Sweden, and the Russian and Polish shtetls. One of them told the story of his immigrant experience in this memoir about life in Winnipeg's North End. I grew up, live in, and currently raise my family on the territory of the Homusqueam people on the banks of the Fraser River, and I'm grateful to live there. I'm also grateful to be here today on the territory of the Algonquin Nation. Remarkably, I think, entire cities sit on top of these unceded lands. Vancouver, my home, and Ottawa, Gatineau, the capital region. My thoughts today are my own. I do not speak for Indigenous people or as an Indigenous person. I've learned from many teachers whose influence I acknowledge and represent here. So what I've just done by way of introduction is situate myself and my knowledge. I've told you who I am, where I'm from, where I'm at, and who I have learned from. Why take the time to do this, especially in 7 minutes? Well, because, and this is one of my key points for today, learning requires exploration of one's identity. This is a First Peoples principle of learning that applies to all of us. It invites non-Indigenous learners like myself to start with our own bounded selves, rather than with an Indigenous other. This matters because we all internalize things we learn as children. Our childhood experiences become taken for granted assumptions that we take for the norm. The boundaries of our worldview remain invisible to us. Those of us with privilege suffer this illusion the longest because society around us reinforces our ideas. Left in place, these assumptions impede best-intentioned efforts to understand histories and people different from our own. They limit efforts at greater inclusion and diversity to an add and stir approach. Same cup of coffee, different sweetener. Feminists, people of color have pointed out the problem with this for a long time. Left in place, these assumptions also leave us talking about the past instead of about history. Let me explain what I mean. I'm going to take some examples from a social studies textbook that I recently reviewed. The book aimed to improve historical representations of Indigenous peoples, and on this count, it did a good job. It also exemplified the issue that I've just outlined. It contained a lot about the past and was inadequately historical. That is, it treated concepts that were specific to particular times and places as though they were unbounded and universal. Things European still pass as universal because of the long entwined histories of racism and colonialism. One influential scholar refers in this light to the need to provincialize Europe, to demarcate the boundaries around European knowledge, making it situated, local, and specific. For example, a well-intentioned lesson plan could emphasize Indigenous peoples' role in the fur trade with a sentence like, Indigenous peoples were highly skilled at navigating and surviving the wilderness. This makes space for Indigenous presence and simultaneously erases Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing their territory. Wilderness, after all, is a place that humans neither modify nor call home. Indigenous territories were homelands, and there was no wilderness. Similarly, we could present the range of human interactions with the environment by saying Indigenous peoples used natural resources in unique, sophisticated ways. Again, this constrains Indigenous people at the same time that it makes space for them in our history. Natural resources is a culturally specific, market-driven category for thinking about nature. Treating natural resources as a universal category implies that utility always defines the relationship between humans and the environment. That, for example, a cedar tree could either be milled for lumber or be carved into a canoe. But what if a cedar tree is your relation? Indigenous peoples configure animacy, kin, nature, and utility in entirely different ways, and we cannot see this if we try to add and stir them into our pre-existing category of natural resources. As I'm outlining, our conventional vocabulary attributes an unbounded universality to many European concepts. And when we use this vocabulary, we reproduce colonialist assumptions. Where I'm from, it can pass as uncontroversial to say that this man, the first governor of British Columbia, had a responsibility to maintain law and order. Yet this phrase treats law and order as singular, as if only the British had law. And it implies that Douglas's responsibility was legitimately bestowed. This is a completely European perspective. Indigenous peoples have their own systems of law and constitutionality. That's what's going on in the lower left-hand image. What Douglas brought was British law and order. And so we might be more specific and clarify that the British do not have a monopoly on law and that their sense of responsibility was self-imposed. Treaties are something that exist within multiple systems of law. And we could try to recognize an Indigenous perspective by noting that Indigenous peoples believed treaties were land-sharing agreements. But this implies that Indigenous peoples believed while Europeans knew, presumably, the truth. Europeans don't have a monopoly on truth any more than they do on law. This two-row wampum belt is a legally binding Haudenosaunee document that speaks the truth of Indigenous law. My contention is that these textbook examples are cases of a much broader phenomena. When we treat categories like natural resources, wilderness, or law as universal, singular, and unbounded, we undermine the diversity and equity we might elsewhere aim for in policy and educational initiatives. Before we can seek something called reconciliation, we must admit some things are irreconcilable. We cannot create anti-racist histories by inserting Indigenous characters into the boundaries of our existing narratives and categories. Thank you. Merci.
Hi, my name is Keith Banting, and I want to talk to you this evening for 7 minutes about what I've called the biggest boundary, biggest at least geographically in the Canadian context, perhaps not the most divisive, the sorts of boundaries that Paige was speaking about, maybe more intensely divisive, but the boundaries I want to talk about, generated by the system of immigration, are clearly powerful boundaries. They're a legal boundary, and in some cases a physical one, as in the case of the United States. These are boundaries between us and them. Indeed, immigration politics are all about boundaries, all the time. These boundaries are enforced by the state, and fear that a country's borders are not secure generates considerable public anxiety. In recent years, many international commentators have been impressed by the strength of public support for an expansive immigration program in Canada. At a time of considerable backlash elsewhere, Canada has actually been increasing its immigration annual intake. When in late 2015, the federal government accepted 50,000 Syrian refugees, most commentators, Canadian and international, agreed with The Economist magazine that the secret to the Canadian comfort with immigration is its distinctive culture and identity, both of which celebrate diversity. And yet, there are other voices in our politics, other voices which challenge immigration and which cite culture as a reason for challenging the immigration program and for challenging multiculturalism. Moreover, we know that populist backlash elsewhere has been driven by a toxic combination, not just of culture and cultural anxiety, but also of economy, of economics and economic anxiety. And so I think I'm going to start by suggesting that we should be careful about assuming that support for immigration in this country can be based on cultural grounds alone. I think we need to dig a little deeper. So let's step back and let's ask when and why the current level of support for immigration emerged. Canadians have not always been supportive of immigration. Historians have documented the many dark episodes in our history in the first half of the 20th century, but I think we also need to pay much closer attention to our recent history. Because until the mid-1990s, the overwhelming bulk of Canadians believed that immigration levels were too high. This is a chart which tracks support for immigration in this country, and it's the response of Canadians in a survey to the proposition there's too much immigration in Canada. The green line shows the proportion of respondents who agreed with that proposition, and the red line indicates the proportion of respondents who disagreed. Now, what is striking here is that until the mid-1990s, a substantial portion, between 60 and 65% of Canadians, thought that immigration levels were much too high. And then, stunningly, strikingly, rapidly, things changed. And Canadians shifted their views, and within 5 years, the proportion of Canadians who thought that immigration levels are too high dropped significantly, and those who were comfortable with the existing levels of immigration basically doubled. And this happened within 5 years, which is a remarkably short period of time. And it's these attitudes which have been stable since then. Small perturbations, but that basic story continues. So this is a remarkable change, and a colleague and I have been trying to understand it. Where did this come from? What drove it? What sustains it? Our efforts have uncovered a variety of factors, but I would like to stick to just two: the economy and our culture. First, on the economy. I'm very old. You can tell from the color of my hair. I'm old enough to remember when the unemployment rate in this country hit 13% in the recession of the early 1980s and over 11% in the recession of the early 1990s. In those years, support for immigration rose and fell with the business cycle. But the unemployment rate, this unemployment rate dropped steadily in the 1990s, reaching a much lower and relatively stable level in the 2000s. And at the moment, we're running in a 5% range, almost a third of what it was in the early 1980s. And recessions in Canada have been relatively mild. Certainly the recession of 2007-8, which was so powerfully destructive in a lot of European societies, was relatively mild here. I think that the better economic context in which immigration attitudes are formed makes it much more difficult to scapegoat newcomers, to complain that immigrants are stealing our jobs. And in our work, the decline in the unemployment rate turns out to have been the strongest individual factor in explaining the change in attitudes. This economic impact was reinforced by the actual transformation of the immigration program into an economic program. In Canada, it's a mantra that Canada adopted the point system in 1967. But a point system doesn't matter at all if the economic class of immigrants is small. That is, if the proportion of immigrants selected by that procedure are small. And for decades after 1967, family reunification was the big category in the Canadian immigration system, and it's only in the mid-1990s, that period of big change in our attitudes, that the Canadian government squeezed family reunification as a category and radically increased the proportion of immigrants in the economic class, making it by far the biggest category. This is, as we see, precisely the same period in which Canadians overwhelmingly came to believe that immigration is good for the economy. This is another slide. It's the response of respondents to the proposition, the economic impact of immigrants is positive. As you can see in the mid-1990s, the green line, those who agree with that proposition, rises substantially, and it's stable since. Those are stunning numbers in international context. Okay, so I guess I'm arguing here that there was an economic context which underpinned the willingness of Canadians to shift their attitudes on immigration. But what our culture? Doesn't it matter? I'm sure that faith and multiculturalism does play a role in softening some of the internal boundaries within Canada. But I think culture plays a very different role in how many and who gets through the door into the country in the first place. Cross-national surveys reveal that Canadians are as insistent as any European public that immigrants should fit in. In the current period, cultural anxieties about immigration are clearly prominent, especially prominent in Quebec, but they're not limited to Quebec. This slide captures, responses to the proposition that, quote, too many immigrants are not adopting Canadian values, end of quote. And as you can see, in the same time period, from the mid-1990s, there is a softening in the proportion of Canadians who support that proposition. But the fall is not as sharp as in the economic transformations that were the context for these changing attitudes. And there's a rise. Those attitudes, the sense that too many immigrants are not adopting Canadian values bumps up again in the period from about 2007 to about 2015. One of my colleagues was unkind enough to call it the Kenny bump. Not surprisingly, in our statistical analysis, half of Canadians who are worried about whether immigrants are adopting values, the 52% are adopting our values, are much less likely to support ambitious immigration levels. And these cultural anxieties are have undoubtedly contributed to and being reinforced by the increased political polarization over immigration in recent years. Conservative supporters and supporters of other political parties now differ significantly in their views on immigration. And this greater polarization helps explain, the greater political contestation over these issues in recent years. So, if we step back and ask how did those, in what context did those that big pattern of attitudes towards immigration shift, I think there is both an economic and a cultural story. The dramatic growth in Canadian support for immigration in the 1990s and its stability through the 2000s was underpinned by economic factors, a comparatively low unemployment rate, and the transformation of immigration into an economic instrument. Cultural anxiety did ease, but it remains significant in the Canadian context. But so far, however, the widespread belief in immigration is good for the economy offsets these lingering cultural anxieties, at least in the data analysis that we've done. Okay, so looking forward, what value is this kind of analysis? What are the implications? What does it tell us? In 2016, the Advisory Council on Economic Growth to the Minister of Finance of the federal government urged that the federal government raise immigration levels to 450,000 by 2021, an increase of over 50% over the level that had prevailed at that time, as part of a strategy of growing the Canadian population dramatically. So far, the federal government has avoided such a bold commitment and has raised the target to 350,000, which is still a significant increase over the patterns that had persisted throughout the 2000s when the number fluctuated between about 250,000 and 280,000. Now, what is striking is that so far, although there's been pushback, we've seen political pushback, largely rooted in cultural anxieties, the basic fundamentals of Canadian support have not shifted. The continued decline in the unemployment rate, I suspect, has been important, that we're slipping down into the 5% range. And so perhaps we are on good, solid ground still. But are we good to go with a big jump? Because this is a time, this may be Canada's time. Maybe this is a time when we can grow, when we can, given the fact that other countries are turning away people, move aggressively. Is this our time to move aggressively into a much more expansive immigration world? I have a word of caution. I think we're in a curious period. The unemployment rate is no longer a good proxy for economic security. Despite such low unemployment as we enjoy at the moment, Canadians are uneasy, even anxious about their economic prospects and the economic prospects of their children. Growing inequality, disruption in the global economy, the economics of technological change, the gig economy, and precarious forms of employment have generated a palpable sense of economic concern, anxiety, insecurity. And the political parties are jockeying to tap into this unease in the current election campaign. Would Canadians in this context support big increases in the immigration file? In my view, those who support Canada's approach to immigration, especially those who seek to grow it, and that would include me, should not assume that immigration is simply baked into our culture and that it is sufficient on its own to sustain an ambitious immigration program. It strikes me that supporters, including me, need to focus not just on instances of cultural intolerance that still exist, but also on issues of economic anxiety, economic insecurity, growing inequality, and a sort of social justice agenda for the population as a whole. Limiting the potential for populist backlash and hardening of the big boundary requires working, I think, on both economic and cultural justice agendas. Otherwise, we might end up with Charlie Brown. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Adrian Owen. 22 years ago, I was introduced to a young school teacher from Cambridge in the UK. Her name was Kate. Now, Kate wasn't like you, and she wasn't like me. She was living in a state that used to be referred to, or was often referred to, as a persistent vegetative state. Kate was literally living on the boundary between life and death. She would open and close her eyes. She would occasionally stare blankly around the room. She would cough and she would yawn. But like all patients who were described as being in a vegetative state, Kate showed no responses to any form of external stimulation. If you asked her to squeeze your hand, nothing. If you asked her to blink her eyes, nothing. And again, like all patients in this condition, it was generally assumed that Kate had no awareness. That is, she wasn't aware of who she wasn't aware of where she was, and she certainly wasn't aware of the predicament that she was in. Now, my colleagues and I had an idea that we would put Kate into a brain scanner and see whether we could work out what was going on with her brain. While she was in the scanner, we showed her pictures of faces of her friends and family. Now, this is something that nobody had ever done before at that point, and to be honest, most people thought we were pretty crazy. I mean, what was the point? It was a waste of time and a waste of money. But remarkably, when Kate was exposed to these pictures of faces of people she knew, her brain activated. It lit up. But what did that mean? Was this some kind of automatic brain response, a sort of an echo from the abyss, or was this a sign that there was something more going on in Kate's brain than any of us knew? Well, to be really honest, I had absolutely no idea back then, but we did know that we had discovered something that was potentially very important. Now, over the next few years, I saw many patients who were like Kate, and we put them into brain scanners, and we saw all sorts of responses to pictures, responses to words, sentences, even complete stories. But still, we didn't know what these brain signs meant. What did it mean when somebody's brain responded to a familiar stimulus that we presented to them? Again, was there more going on in the brains of these patients than any of us had up until that point realized? And it was in 2006 that we really had our major breakthrough. I realized that if we were going to truly understand what was going on for these patients, we would have to get one of them to communicate with us. And not to communicate with speech or movements, because of course none of these patients could do that. But the question was, could we get a patient to communicate using just their brain? Now, Gillian was a patient who I saw in 2006 who had been involved in a complex road traffic accident. And when she came to our attention, she'd been in a vegetative state for some months. We put Gillian into the scanner and we said, if you understand what we're saying to you now, could you imagine that you're waving your arms around as if you were playing a game of tennis? And remarkably, when we asked Gillian to do this, an area of her brain known as the premotor cortex, it's right up here on top of your brain, it sprung to life. And that's a part of the brain that we know is involved in imagining complex movements, as if you were imagining playing a game of tennis. And when we asked Gillian to stop thinking about this, activity in this area of the brain disappeared. And we repeated this many times. She was able to produce these responses, not physical responses, but responses with her brain whenever we asked her to do it. Gillian was conscious. Gillian was in there. She was aware. She just hadn't been able to move a single muscle in her body to indicate this to anybody around her. Now, in 2010, I moved my research team from the University of Cambridge to Western University in London, Ontario, and within a month of arriving in Canada, I was introduced to another patient called Scott. Now, like Gillian, Scott had been involved in a complicated road accident, but unlike Gillian, he'd been in a vegetative state for 12 years at the point that we met him. And very quickly, I was able to tell Scott's family and his doctors that he wasn't in a vegetative state at all. He was actually aware. And this is because when we asked him to imagine doing something in the scanner, imagine playing a game of tennis, his brain would activate in much the same way that we had seen previously. But we wanted to push it further than that. We wanted to open a channel of communication so that some of these patients could actually communicate with us. And Scott showed us how to do that. Over a series of many scans, over many months, we taught Scott to communicate, to answer yes and no questions. He would typically imagine he was playing a game of tennis if he wanted to answer yes to a question, or imagine a different scenario, such as moving from room to room in his house, if he wanted to, for example, say no, or answer no to a question. And in this way, we were able to find out many things about Scott, about the situation he was in, about how he felt about that, about some of the memories that he had and some of his needs and desires, including whether he was in any pain. Now, over the last 20 years or so, since we did that original scan, we've learned many, many things about this population of patients. Many different centers around the world now use these techniques to identify patients who are in this condition and even to communicate with them. And it turns out that about 1 in 5 or 20% of patients who appear to be completely vegetative, completely non-responsive, are in fact aware, and in many cases, for decades have been lying silently listening to every conversation going on around them. Now, you might be wondering what happened to Kate, that school teacher in Cambridge, who started this cascade of events that's led me to be here today. Well, again, remarkably, after some months after we scanned her, Kate began to recover. And she's talked very publicly about the many struggles she had coming back from that boundary between life and death. She's described how she tried to kill herself by holding her breath. She had no other way of doing it. She's also talked about the tremendous stress, the terror, actually, she says, of being aware in the presence of other people who have no idea that you are there at all. But for me, the most important thing that Kate has taught me over the last 20 years or so, is that she says the day that we scanned her is the day that she became a person again. It's the day when people stopped treating her like an object and started to treat her like a human being. And that's why we do what we do. I mean, this all began, for me anyway, about almost 30 years ago now, as a journey to try and unravel the mysteries of the brain. But it's turned into something much more interesting and much more personal, as we try and pull these people back from the void, try and give them a voice and reconnect them with the people that they love and the people who love them. And ultimately, bring them back and give them a place where they belong, back in the land of the living. Thanks very much.
I'm Jake Stika, and I'm a man. I look like a man. I'm of an appropriate height, 5'20" for those wondering. I have facial hair and a receding hairline, and I dress in muted tones. I also act and feel like a man, whatever that means. What these things mean to me is probably different than what they mean to you, or the guy in line at Tim Hortons. Here's how I came to my understanding of what it means to be a man. Let's go all the way back to my paternal grandparents. You see, back in the 70s, you didn't get to travel from communist Czechoslovakia much. But my grandmother was fluent in 7 languages, which meant she was uniquely qualified for her job as a technical secretary sent on diplomatic missions to far-flung places like Uruguay and Kenya, leaving my grandfather as primary caregiver to their 2 sons. Now, I won't say my grandfather was a transformative caregiver, but he kept them clothed and fed, and took some of the load. My father took some of the load as he was 6 years older than my uncle. So when I got to know my grandpa, I knew him as a kindly man with wispy white hair and eyebrows that looked drawn on with Sharpies, that was supportive of my grandmother and my old man. Now, when my parents and I immigrated to Canada as the Berlin Wall fell, we had the classic immigrant story of leaving Czechoslovakia on vacation to Austria, never to return. My dad hustled and worked under the table, even sleeping in the closet at his employer's, several towns away, so he could send money back to my mom and I in the refugee camp. When we came to Canada, this man, who had been the youngest manager by 10 years of the largest data center in Czechoslovakia, took an entry-level job as a computer programmer with Burns Meats. Remember that hot dog company that used to be at part of every barbecue? Despite all the hard work and sacrifice, I never found him to be absent. He supported my mother, and he was a doting father to me. He even shifted his working hours to 7 to 3, so he could always take me to basketball. Finally, let's talk about me. I grew up an only child, and as a newcomer to this country, everything I learned in relation to others. I remember going to preschool and bawling my eyes out because I couldn't understand anyone until a kindly woman named Irene took me by the hand and walked me around and pointed out things like tree and green. I remember in elementary school wearing what I thought at the time was this wicked tie-dye WWE t-shirt, but it happened to be pink and purple and being made fun of relentlessly. I remember never backing down from a fight, resulting in many visits of my mother to the principal's office. I remember attaining status as a star athlete. There goes Jake, the basketball player, as I walked around my high school. I remember thinking that I wasn't much of a man until I lost my virginity in university. Growing up, it was clear to me that being a man existed in the confines of what I like to call the man box. Never show emotion unless it's anger. Don't ask for help lest you be considered weak. Have a lot of sex with women, or at least be seen as doing so. Distance yourself from anything feminine lest you be considered gay. Have more power and more status than the next guy. You see, but I also remember binge drinking in second-year university when I was academically ineligible to play basketball. I remember my best friend's 13-year-old brother dying by suicide, likely due to homophobic bullying when we were just 21. I remember reading The Game as more of a manual on how to pick up women than a journalistic expose. I remember breaking down and sharing thoughts and feelings I'd never shared with anyone before with my girlfriend when I was 22, as I was struggling with depression and going to therapy. Suffice to say, coming of age was a difficult time. Stepping outside of the man box can be like trying to cross the demilitarized zone in between North and South Korea. Don't step on the crying like a girl mine, or get shot in the back with a homophobic slur for telling another man you care about them. The folks who have led the way in removing these landmines and snipers are women and those who identify as gender and sexually diverse. Us men have had a lack of role models when it comes to shifting the status quo. I was lucky in that I've had men around me show me what a man could be. My grandfather showed me that you can be supportive of your partner's rock star career and not be considered less than. My father showed me that being a breadwinner is not an excuse for not being a nurturing and doting parent. My best friend showed me what it is to mourn and grieve and create space for others not like us. I showed myself how strong and courageous it is to be vulnerable, ask for help, and bounce back. What I want you to leave tonight with is, as long as we keep coding these traits as either masculine or feminine, we will be stuck in this hierarchy where contextually one is deemed more valuable than the other. Women will languish at work as traditional ideals of leadership remain masculine, while men will feel inadequate as caregivers among their peers as long as nurturing remains feminine. Women don't need to be told to act like men in heels to get ahead, just as much as men don't need to be told to get in touch with their inner feminine just to emote. Over the last 70-plus years, under the banner of feminism, we've had a brilliant conversation about women's roles and identities in society today. We've done a much better job of telling our daughters that they can do anything boys can do. But until we begin to do as good a job of telling our sons that they can do anything girls can do, we'll be stuck with masculinity and femininity, and the boundary between where the breadth of the human experience resides. Patriarchy, by definition, is handed down to us through our forefathers. And if I look at mine, I know they'd be proud of me for breaking the mold and breaking out of the bandbox for both you and me. Thank you.
Whether it is Trump in the US, Putin in Russia, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Modi in India, leaders of some of the largest states in the world are today successfully mobilizing their people in the name of nationalism. And these strident nationalisms in the names of dominant ethnic groups pitted against minorities seem to have sealed nationalism's notorious association with discrimination, division, and destruction. Indeed, many scholars would say that the last analogous global upsurge of nationalism culminated in the Second World War. And writing in that context, Albert Einstein had famously termed nationalism as the measles of mankind, an infantile disease that we would outgrow with modernity. And these twin assumptions, that nationalism is evil and that it would fade away, particularly with the universalizing power of the market, has brought together scholars as ideologically opposed as Karl Marx to Francis Fukuyama. And yet, here we are today. I'm Prerna Singh, and I'm here to tell you that this persistence of nationalism is not necessarily bad news. 400 years ago, the Treaty of Westphalia established nationalism as the legitimating ideology on the basis of which states rule. And we continue to live today in this world of nation states. Even with some attenuation of their power with globalizations, nations remain the central form of political community, the key units that we have today for administering justice. And so inasmuch as nations are here to stay, so too is nationalism. And this is because at its root, nationalism is a especially powerful type of group identity. And as such, it fulfills both a fundamental biological need that we have as humans for living in groups, as well as a psychological need for community as a source of validation and self-esteem. Belonging to a national political community has been shown to protect us from feelings of alienation, of solitude, and giving us a sense of autonomy. Critically, my own research as a political scientist has shown that nationalism is also an important driver for the functioning of liberal democracies and the realization of social, political, and economic freedoms. Liberal democratic states owe citizens rights, and citizens in turn are obliged to fulfill certain duties towards the state. National solidarities infuse these technical ties of citizenship with what scholars have termed the magic of my. I feel a stronger sense of commitment towards, I'm more motivated to work for the welfare of my group, my family, my nation. Experiments in social psychology have shown that this is because we feel a sense of we-ness, an idea of a linked fate, a shared destiny. My own individual welfare is linked to that of my national community as a whole. Nationalism makes a state home. The obligations that are owed by leaders and citizens are not just to a political administrative unit, they are to my people, to my homeland. In my research, I've shown how, on the one hand, these obligations of nationalism encourage state leaders to prioritize the welfare of the people. National solidarities were important factors in the institution of social welfare regimes across Europe, in Canada, as well as in India. On the other hand, national attachments also motivate citizens to make sacrifices for the state. Sacrifices of time and effort when we vote and participate politically, of money when we pay our taxes on time and honestly, and the most supreme sacrifice of all of our lives when we join the army and fight for our country. But inasmuch as national solidarities are a powerful constructive force, they are bounded. Like all groups, nations have boundaries, those who belong and those who do not. For nation states, this question of who is in and who is out has a literal meaning. Those who are outside its geographic boundaries are also usually outside its boundaries of belonging. So Americans, for instance, do not see Canadians as co-nationals, which of course I know you're all deeply relieved about. There is nothing to condemn in national boundaries per se. A healthy drive for national distinctiveness has driven important contributions in the arts. Think, for example, of Russian literature, of Cuban music, of French cinema or Thai cuisine, and competition for national achievement is, of course, the lifeblood of sports. Moreover, research has shown that there is no reciprocal relationship between in-group and out-group attitudes. What this means is that love for one's own nation does not necessarily imply hostility or hate towards another nation. It can involve distancing, indifference, or as in the case of Canadian nationalism vis-a-vis your southern neighbors, maybe just a little disdain. The real question for nation states is whether the boundaries of belonging include those who are located within our physical boundaries, minorities, native-born, as well as immigrants and refugees. The present crop of nationalisms is so virulent and so vicious that it has almost made us forget that nationalism is fundamentally about love, about fraternity, and about unity. A useful analogy for thinking about nationalism is that national identities are not like hats, or identities more broadly are not like hats. We do wear more than one at one time. So national identities are compatible with, and research has shown, are actually reinforced by other identities, such as gender, class, and ethnicity, and they also sit quite comfortably with universal human cosmopolitan identities. Nationalisms can and have historically, on many instances, been constructed to include minorities through various models of integration. And here, Canadian multiculturalism shows us simultaneously the possibility of how ethnic minorities, linguistic and religious, can be included, as well as the challenge of how much more needs to be done, for instance, in the inclusion of Indigenous people. But inasmuch as it is challenging, building inclusive nations is necessary. Indeed, I would argue it's one of the most urgent tasks facing us today. In America, where I live, nationalism has become synonymous with white Christian nationalism. And in India, where I grew up and which I study, it has become equated with Hindu nationalism. But this is not a reason to give up on nationalism. In fact, it is precisely the reason we must not give up on it, but instead fight to reclaim it from these exclusive definitions and to put forward more expansive ideas of us, to widen the boundaries of our national we through policies of representation and redistribution, as also through everyday practices about the flags we fly, the statues we erect, the festivals we celebrate, and the songs that we sing. Such an inclusive nationalism can promote those very freedoms that the exclusive nationalisms of today are threatening. This is a nationalism that we must fight for. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samra Habib. In my first year of school in Lahore, Pakistan, I met Khala, a cool kid with the fluffiest of curls that would reveal tiny flecks of gold in the afternoon sunlight. We were both about 6 years old. Prior to starting school that year, my parents would give us regular lessons on hiding our religious identity. You see, we're Ahmadis, a religious minority sect regularly persecuted in Pakistan by Muslim extremists. Ahmadis are regularly punished, legally and through extreme measures, for anything from using a traditional Muslim greeting in public to reciting the call to prayer. In fact, we're even forbidden from calling ourselves Muslim. One afternoon, as I made my way through the crowd at the Ahmadi Mosque during Friday's sermon, I noticed a girl with dark brown curls peeking out from a tightly wrapped white headscarf. My heart stopped. It was Khola from my class. She must have felt my gaze on her because she turned around and smiled. She made her way toward me, and we hugged, and we shared our surprise at seeing each other at the mosque. Soon the azan, the call to prayer, came on, signaling that the prayer was about to start, and I returned to my mom's side. I felt relieved and energized by the discovery that I wasn't alone in this secret. Someone I saw every day at school had to hide who she was as well. The next day in class, I eagerly greeted Khola and told her how nice it was to see her at the mosque. "What are you talking about?" she replied. "That wasn't me." Clearly, she had remembered her parents' advice, unlike me. As you can tell, from a very early age, I felt like there was no place for me in Islam, even though it was such a crucial part of my upbringing. It informed how I saw the world. What made things a bit more challenging was the fact that I'm also queer. And queer Muslims aren't always accepted by mainstream mosques. Once again, I felt like an outsider, like I had no right to call myself Muslim. Were there others like me who felt the same way? I wondered. To find out, I launched a photography project called Just Me and Allah. I traveled around the world to find out what different queer Muslims' relationship with Islam was. I photographed and interviewed people from Istanbul to Brooklyn and learned that Islam is not a monolithic religion. Muslims' relationship with Islam is shaped by geography, class, race, gender. All of my subjects were questioning what it meant to be Muslim in the 21st century. Who decides who gets to call themselves Muslim? Doesn't matter. No was the consensus. In a way, the experience helped me reimagine my idea of home and community. I learned that my community isn't necessarily limited by geographical boundaries. It's knitted together by the belief that we're allowed to hold on to our Muslim faith and proudly call ourselves Muslim, even if we are rejected by so many. Recently, my younger brother Bilal asked me, "Why do you need to call yourself Muslim?" Maybe it's our age difference, but we've never really discussed his relationship with Islam at any great length. I thought about his question. Why do I feel loyalty toward Islam when, as Bilal sees it, Islam isn't always kind towards queer Muslims like me? The reality is that this identity has shaped the way I see the world and the way others see me in a way that is beyond my control. Being Muslim is one of the only absolutes about myself I can be sure of. It serves as an anchor when I'm lost at sea. It helps me come back to myself, and it leads me to others who've struggled to reconcile seemingly disparate parts of themselves. For me, it's not something I can just put on and take off like a garment. There's no denying that my identity as a queer Muslim is the lens through which I see and engage with so many aspects of my daily life. Not everyone is equipped for activism in the traditional sense, marching, writing letters to officials, but dedicating your life to understanding yourself can be its own form of protest, especially when the world tells you that you don't exist. Throughout my childhood, I faced a very real fear that revealing my identity would put me in great danger. Once I started figuring out the many factors that define me, I was able to offer insight from the point of view I had searched for my entire life. I began to look outside myself. I understood my place in the world, and now I wanted to help others do the same. Maybe this identity, this label that defines me, is my house. And my voice was in here all along. What luck to have this house with a solid foundation, this home that supports me as I redefine my perspective over and over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our Walrus talkers tonight. Obviously, boundaries and belonging are inextricably linked. I want to say that by being here, you are all Walri and you belong. And thank you for that. And please join me in thanking all of our talkers, Mary Soderstrom, Paige Raveon, Keith Banting, Adrian Owen, Jake Stika, Prerna Singh, and Samra Habib. Thank you all. As Alan mentioned at the beginning, we're thrilled that tonight is the first of a four-event series we're producing with CIFAR. In addition to tonight's conversation, we're in the throes of producing future CIFAR Presents the Walrus Talks on survival, intelligence, and exploration. And you will be able to either attend those talks or watch those videos and more at thewalrus.ca. Now, if the audience would just hang for a minute, I'm going to invite our talkers to stand up and go ahead into the reception. We do this so you won't trap them in the front row. Off you go. Thank you. Thank you all. And while they are going, I'm going to tell you a couple of quick things about the Walrus. If you've enjoyed tonight's event, you can watch past Walrus Talks. As I said, tonight's our 113th times 7-minute talkers is more than 800 7-minute videos on our YouTube channel. And to further support these important Canadian conversations, please consider, those of you who did not put your hand up, those of you who are not always my people, those of you who have not yet subscribed to the Walrus magazine, just for you tonight, a full year's subscription to the Walrus is just $25. That's 10 issues delivered to your door practically by me. Like, it's a very personal thing, the Walrus. Please keep in mind that fake news is cheap to make and fact-based journalism is expensive. And at the Walrus, all of our journalism is fact-based. A lot of people say they're in the fact news. They're in the fact business now. We're also in the fact-checking business, which is different. So please consider joining our community of more than 2,000 donors across the country who support independent journalism. Your support is essential, and it allows us to discuss issues that are vitally important to each of us. Any small gift you make tonight by way of a donation, this is kind of cool. We have a couple, Francis and Tim Price. We thought they could be here tonight, but they can't be. They will match every dollar you donate tonight, and they are matching every dollar donated to the Walrus up to $100,000. So if you give $5, it becomes 10. If you give 50,000, it becomes 100. Like, you can do the math. It makes a really big difference. And if anyone makes a donation of $100 tonight that then gets doubled, we will also send you home with a much coveted Walrus tote bag. So you can do that at the table out there. Meet the Walrus team, Kaylin, Blair, and Andrea, or feel free to hand your credit card or diamonds, stock, land, whatever you've got to me. I'll be out there too. And please sign up for our newsletter so you don't miss any future Walrus Talks. We'll be back here in Ottawa on Tuesday, November 19th. Thank you to Dr. Alan Bernstein, Catherine Riddell, Rachel Parker, Jackie Sullivan, and everyone at CIFAR for their support. As Alan said, there's a booth out there where you can sign up for their newsletter. And thank you to our national partners at Inspire, Labatt, Air Canada, and Shaw for being with us across the country. Isn't it great that I have so many people to thank? I think it's awesome. Thank you to the Canadian Museum of History for hosting us tonight, and please join us at the reception where there is food, there is drink. If you are there, there will also be good conversation, and you can buy books by two of our talkers, Mary Soderstrom's book, Frenemy Nations, and we also have, Samara's book as well, which is, you'll just have to look for what it's called, because I wrote it down and I can't find it. The final thing I have to say for you is that we want you to remember one thing, if you remember anything at all: we are not the walrus, you are actually the walrus. Thank you for coming.